Swahili, Arab, Mijikenda was and has been centrally underpinned by the distribution of land in urban and rural spaces. It is this fratricity of land distribution on the coast amongst multiple moral ethnicities and racial categories that complicated the deployment of a selective collective memory of past injustice during and after the decolonization period. On the coast and elsewhere, a fundamental colonial distinction between natives and non-natives provided the main framework through which land was administered during the colonial period. This distinction was primarily based on race. But in a region such as the coast, where ethnic and racial boundaries had been multiple and porous, this process of colonial land distribution between natives and non-natives served to freeze racial and ethnic identity, so that by the late colonial era, Swahili, Arab, and Mijikenda had not only been strongly imagined and formed, but had also become antagonistic, divided by different perceptions of privilege and injustice. This happened notwithstanding a broader and salient coastal unity against our country, Kenya. The paper therefore addresses the literature on the invention of ethnicity, adding that the nature of land distribution, particularly during the decolonization decades, is central to the understanding of ethnic politics and ideas of belonging during the post-colonial decades. In addition, the essay reasserts the significance of the colonial moment in the invention and imagination of ethnicity in Africa by examining the process through which identity politics on the Kenyan coast became much more vigorous and much more publicized during the late colonial era. This significance has recently been downplayed by both historians and political scientists, who suggest that roots of contemporary identities and political cultures in Africa lie in the pre-colonial period. Spear, 2003, in conceptualizing neo-traditionalism, led others into concluding that the dichotomy created by colonialism between modernity and tradition allowed new possibilities for cultural entrepreneurship. The argument above is that ethnicity was not a novel feature of the colonial world, but the process through which ethnicities were made and remade gained new force because of colonialism. This paper will therefore focus on the period, the decolonization period 1952 to 1962, examining trends of coastal politics, how they related to identity, and how identity related to the nature of land distribution in turn. It is through this analysis that the failure of the imagination of a post-political community during post-colonial decades will be framed. During the time of colonial expansion, the East African coast consisted of a coastal political economy that linked various city-states ruled from Zanzibar by an Omani Sultan. These city-states made up an East African littoral constituting an Indian Ocean trading complex, with networks as far as Middle East and China. This economy reached its zenith during the mid-19th century, where the main items of exchange included ivory, slaves, clothes, and grain. For the hinterland coastal communities, variously referred to as the Nika, during the early 20th century, the 19th century was a time of turmoil. A number of recurrent periods of drought drew younger Nika men and women from the control of so systems of government that are led by old men. That existed in the hinterland, towards the patronage systems that were emerging through the coastal towns like Mombasa and Malindi. And while there, these young Nika men and women acquired a different identity. Most of them became Muslim, who would much later become Swahili. Some of them even became Arab. Identity was less an issue about blood relations or shared needs of politics, but more about patronage networks. And due to the increasing wealth accruing to patrons of coastal city-states, the balance of privilege was tilting towards the coastal strip for a considerable amount of time. Those who would be defined as Arabs or descendants of migrants that had come from Oman and elsewhere since the 17th century were therefore enjoying political and economic privilege by the time the British arrived. Their proximity to the Indian Ocean in Mombasa, Malindi, Takaungu placed them at a strategic position which gave them exposure and access to world markets, while at the same time connecting them to hinterland hunter-gatherer, pastoralists, and cultivating groups. By the 19th century, when British interest in the region began to grow, and when Said Said, Sultan of Oman, relocated his capital from Muscat to Zanzibar to set up the intricate Indian Ocean trading complex, a local logic of racial hierarchy and domination, made particularly salient by slavery, had been established. However, people could easily cross these boundaries through a system of patronage networks, i.e., if you're Nyika, it meant that you relied on hinterland systems of patronage. And if you're Arab or Swahili, it meant that you relied on postal networks of patronage. But through a series of British colonial treaties with the Sultan of Zanzibar that each involved a degree of legal prestidigitation, this pre-established Arab prestige was formalized and frozen, animating further the politics of identity in the region. What was defined in an 1886 Anglo-German treaty as the Sultan's territories on the coast, a strip 10 miles in width, was never formally colonized by the British, and the Sultan of Zanzibar was allowed retention of nominal sovereignty over this area until 1963, when that sovereignty was given to an independent Kenyan state. Since the British were keen on preserving what they understood as pre-existing land rights of the Sultan's subjects, whom colonial administration had also categorized as non-natives and of distinct Arab race, Arabs were given legal and individual freehold title to land along the 10-mile coastal strip. In addition, an Arab administrative system of rule along the strip was preserved and expanded, while Arab elected representation in the Colonial Legislative Council in Nairobi alongside European and Asians was provided. Similar to Zanzibar, British rule on the Kenyan coast did not create Arab racial privilege and African oppression, but it created a context in which antagonism between Arab and African became increasingly bitter and violent in the late colonial period. Modern interests that were shaped by British colonialism became increasingly promoted in terms of traditional values. The idea of Swahili, which was a loose category located between Arab and African, fell out of favor for many who had previously identified themselves as such. Instead, appeals to an Arab descent and tradition became more desirable during the colonial era for those who could will them. By the 1940s and 50s, the term Swahili had become a term of opprobrium, and other terms such as Ithnashara Toifa and Telata Toifa were variously invented in its place. So these are Arab names. And so with them then you see this kind of politics of wanting to appear as Arab and not African. During the colonial period, some 9 collectivities of African groups, which had been containerized now by colonial administrative policies into 2 colonial districts, Kilifi and Kwale, in the immediate coastal hinterland, also began to do this imagination and invention. Eventually calling themselves the Mijikenda to replace the older derogatory term Nika that had been used to describe them. Based on a shared tradition of common origin, descent and migration, the imagination and invention of the Mijikenda gained traction amongst a population of people with considerable intelligibility of culture, language, and social institutions. The Mijikenda were aware of multiple distinctive group identities, but were also constantly faced with the reminders of their commonality. Right now, current historiographies accepted as truth, taught in schools, and verified by repetition, base this unified and discrete Mijikenda identity in a history of shared migration from a northern place called Singwaya, a tradition which actually did not exist before the 20th century. By the late colonial era and beyond, the hardening of boundaries between Arab, Mijikenda, and Swahili was thus complete. So during the 1950s, when nascent political activity amongst the Mijikenda began, a rather moribund organization had been formed by young and educated Nika professionals, calling itself the Mijikenda Union. This trend followed that of the formation of the Luo Union, the Kisii Union, and others. Broadly, the 1940s was the time of African nationality, symbolized by the formation of the Kenya African Union. the first African member of the Legislative Council had been appointed in 1942, and Africans were beginning to ask for more inclusion into the racial colonial system of domination. On the Kenyan coast, where Arabs or groups termed non-native had enjoyed legislative representation and title to land, a movement emerged, calling itself the Mombao movement, that was led by Coast People's Party and the Afro-Shirazi Party, demanding for the independence of the coastal strip, then the Kenya Protectorate, from the rest of Kenya in the event the British left. This claim was purely based on the fact that these groups had enjoyed access to land on the coastal strip, through which personal titles had been given. This was also based on their designation as non-natives, as natives were perceived by colonial authorities to have not developed systems of private property rights. The Mijikenda leader, Ngala, attempted to revive the Mijikenda Union to press for the claims of African groups in the coastal region towards all coastal land, including the towns of Mombasa and Malindi. Through interviews, people who witnessed these events claimed that Ngala ran a campaign asking Mijikenda to bury their dead on the coastal strip and plant permanent trees there, so as to complicate Arab claims to coastal land. Rather than complete independence from Kenya, in the event the British left, the Mijikenda, through their leaders, demanded for a strong coastal provincial government, preferably a federal government, that would stand as a protection against potential country domination of the coast, but also to reverse Arab privilege in land distribution. The latter movement became known as Majikenda, meaning federal government. During the Rasta independence talk, the Mombao movement was defeated, but a host of concessions were made, including having the Kurdish spot in the constitution, including recognizing Arab titles on the coastal strip, and many, many others. Arabs have always complained that some of these concessions, Kenyatta and Moi later went back and grabbed their land. But then Kenya became independent with a quasi-federalist constitution, the regional constitution. Some powerful Arab families on the coast left for the Middle East, engendering many, many years later the phenomenon of absentee landlords. However, the earliest organizational reference to people of the coast that attempted to unify a racial and a discrete and complex multiplicity of moral ethnicities found on the region came in 1962, with the formation of the Coast Province United Front, which sought to safeguard the interests of coast people of all races and religions against domination by our country. This early form of cultural and identity brokerage at the coast, based on the fears of the then present status of affairs, was also part of an alternative vision of regional autonomy offered for the future of Kenya that was opposed to nationalistic centralization. Arguments which became sharper as the prospect of independence became imminent. Proponents of this early idea of coastal unity and imagination of Wapwani argued that coastals were different from the rest of Kenya in their distinctive outlook and way of life, which had given them a greater measure of peace, harmony, and regard for each other, and a sense of toleration than had existed elsewhere in Kenya. The issue of our country, particularly of Kikuyu and Luo domination of coastal customs and economic life, was also dramatically caused in the first instance by a few outspoken Arabs who felt their institutions threatened by these aggressive dynamic groups. Specifically, CPUF had listed a host of grievances, from the neglect of educational and training facilities at the coast, to a country domination of the civil service, the police, and work at the port of Mombasa. In essence, coastal people feared, to the present day, that people from a country with better education and political organization would dominate all the best jobs and land at the coast after British rule ended, if no form of regional autonomy is of course granted. The life of CPUF was brief, but it left a discursive legacy, subsequently picked up by various organizations and individuals that came to claim to represent and speak for Wapwani. The main cleavage within this emerging community of Wapwani has remained between African groups who since the 1940s were referring to themselves as the Mijikenda, and an Arab community originating from Omani migrants and others from elsewhere in the Middle East, laying uneasily between these two quite distinct social categories, was the idea of, still the idea of Swahili, a usefully ambivalent term that could be used both to assert a relationship to a much more ancient immigration from the Middle East, and to also claim a status as descendants of coastal indigenes that had intermarried with or assimilated to this migrant community. This division, centrally informed by the nature of land distribution on the coast amongst these various groups, has continued to complicate the imagination of a coastal political community that attempts to evoke memory of a shared past and common interest. Rather, alongside a collective memory of domination by a country, there also exists amongst Wapwani a divisive and counter-collective memory of an explicitly racial and ethnic hierarchy of domination at the Kenyan coast that had been shaped by pre-colonial and colonial experiences, with Arab privilege remaining the side.
Thank you very much.